She arrived with 9 other women and left with the one man the entire town feared. They laughed when no one picked her. They pointed, whispered, covered their mouths. 10 women stepped off that wagon into the Black Hollow mud, and one by one, men walked forward to claim their future. 9 women found a hand reaching for theirs. Brenna Keegan stood alone. Then a shadow fell across the crowd. Horses shifted. Children grabbed their mothers. A man the size of a barn door rode out of the tree line, face scarred, eyes like flint. And he looked straight at her. I choose that woman. If you've ever been told you weren't enough, stay with me until the end. Like this story, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this reaches. The wagon broke an axle 3 miles outside of Black Hollow, which meant the women had to walk the last stretch of road carrying their own bags through ankle-deep mud, while the driver cursed at his horses and the broker, a thin man named Elias Pratt, kept checking his pocket watch like the delay was a personal insult. Brenna Keegan carried 2 bags, her own and the bag belonging to a young woman named Cecily, who had twisted her ankle, stepping over a rut, and was now limping badly and trying not to cry about it. You don't have to do that, Cecily said, meaning the bag. I know, Brenna said, and kept walking. That was Brenna. She didn't explain herself much. She'd learned early that explaining yourself to people who'd already made up their minds was a waste of breath that could be spent on something useful, like breathing. She was 28 years old, broad-shouldered, with thick red hair she kept braided back because it was practical, and hands that were calloused from years of work. First on her father's farm outside Cork, then in the laundries of Boston, where she'd spent 4 years saving every coin she could manage. She wasn't small, and she wasn't soft, and she knew what people saw when they looked at her, which was not what they'd been hoping to see when they signed up to receive a mail-order bride off a catalog printed on cheap paper with even cheaper promises. She'd read the advertisement 17 times before she answered it. Opportunities for women of strong character and capable constitution. Frontier settlement. Honest men seeking partners in life and labor. Apply through Pratt & Associates, Boston, Massachusetts. Strong character, capable constitution. That was the language of people who needed workers, not wives. Brenna understood that. She'd applied anyway because Boston was eating her alive one gray winter at a time, and she wanted open sky and the chance to build something that was hers, even if the path there was crooked. The path was, in fact, extremely crooked. Literally. The road into Black Hollow wound through pine-covered hills and across 2 creek bridges that groaned under the wagon's weight. And by the time the town came into view, a cluster of wooden buildings pressed together around a main street that turned to soup in the rain. The sky had gone the color of old pewter, and it was starting to spit cold drizzle on everyone's heads. Black Hollow was not what the advertisement had implied. It was a mining and ranching town at the edge of the Montana Territory, the kind of place that existed because it was useful, not because anyone particularly wanted to be there. The buildings were functional and not much more. There was a general store, a livery, a saloon that occupied more square footage than the church, a land office, and a scattering of houses that looked like they'd been dropped from a great height and simply landed where they fell. The main street had 2 wagon ruts worn so deep they could swallow a wheel, and most of the men who'd gathered to watch the women arrive were standing under the saloon's overhang to keep dry. There were perhaps 30 of them. Some had cleaned up for the occasion, fresh-pressed shirts, hair combed, hats held in front of them like they were presenting themselves to a church committee. Others had made no effort whatsoever and smelled like they hadn't either. Elias Pratt climbed up onto the wagon bed before the women had even fully stopped walking and held up his hands like he was quieting a crowd that wasn't making noise yet. "Gentlemen," he said, in the voice of a man who sold things for a living and was good at it. "Thank you for your patience. As promised, 10 women of good character, capable of hard work and homemaking, ready to begin a new chapter here in your fine community." Someone in the crowd said, "Finally," and there was scattered laughter. The women arranged themselves in a rough line. Some of them had tidied their hair during the walk. Some had pinched color into their cheeks. Cecily was still limping slightly. Brenna stood where she stood and didn't do anything different because she'd never learned how to arrange her face into an expression that was designed to make someone choose her. And she'd decided a long time ago she wasn't going to start learning now. What followed was something she would spend a long time afterward trying to find the right word for. It wasn't quite a livestock auction. It wasn't quite a social. It was somewhere between the two. Men stepping forward, introductions being made, Pratt facilitating with the practiced ease of someone who'd run this particular transaction many times before. Arrangements had been made in advance through letters, some of them, so certain pairings had been anticipated, but not all. The women were chosen one by one. First Clara, small and dark-haired, matched to a farmer who'd been corresponding with her for 3 months and looked relieved to find she resembled her description. Then Harriet, whose needlework credentials had apparently impressed a merchant enough that he stepped forward almost immediately. Then Margaret. Then Dora. Then 2 sisters, Nell and Frances, who'd negotiated the terms of their placement together and were met by 2 brothers who seemed equally nervous. Then Ruth. Then Edith. Then Cecily, limping ankle and all, was claimed by a young man who looked at her like she was something he hadn't expected to be handed and wasn't sure what to do with but was going to take very seriously anyway, which left Brenna. She was aware of it before it was technically finished. She could feel the arithmetic of it. 10 women, 9 men, the way the crowd's attention kept sliding over her and then away, like trying to grip wet wood. She kept her face level. She held her bag. She stood in the mud in the drizzling rain and waited for whatever happened next to happen. Pratt was checking his watch again. He walked over to her with the careful expression of a man delivering news he'd delivered before and still hadn't figured out how to make comfortable. "Miss Keegan," he said quietly. "I'm aware," she said. "It's not a reflection." "Mr. Pratt." She said his name the way you'd say stop. "You don't need to explain it to me." He stopped. From somewhere in the crowd, she didn't see who, she didn't look. Someone said something she didn't fully catch, but she heard enough. "Big as a draft horse." And then laughter, the kind that spreads when one person starts it and others join in because it's easier than staying quiet. Brenna looked at the mud around her boots and breathed through her nose. This was the part she'd been afraid of. Not the frontier, not the hard work, not the stranger she'd have to build a life with. This. The moment of being evaluated and found wanting in public, with everyone watching, in a town where she didn't know a single soul and had nowhere to go if this fell apart. Pratt was talking again, something about the next town over, a settlement called Porter's Creek. They might try again there. He was sorry for the inconvenience. The crowd changed. It was subtle at first, the way crowds shift when something enters that changes the weight of the air. People stepping back, heads turning toward the far end of the street. The sound of a horse moving at a walk over wet ground, slow and deliberate, and then silence spreading outward from that sound like rings from a stone dropped in still water. Brenna turned. The man coming down the main street of Black Hollow on a gray horse was the largest human being she had ever seen in person. He was well over 6 feet, built like he'd been constructed for a purpose that required serious structural integrity, broad through the chest and shoulders, with hands the size of dinner plates resting easy on the reins. He wore a heavy canvas coat, dark with old rain. His hair was black and too long, and his jaw carried several days of stubble over a scar that ran from his left cheekbone down toward the corner of his mouth, pale and old and permanent. He rode with the unhurried ease of someone who had nowhere urgent to be and knew it, and his eyes, dark gray, she would learn later, though from where she was standing they looked almost black, moved across the gathered crowd with an expression she couldn't read at first, and then gradually could. He was not afraid of these people, not dismissive of them, not hostile, just not afraid. Like a man standing in weather he'd already decided wasn't going to bother him. The crowd had gone completely quiet. A boy near the saloon whispered something to his father, and his father put a hand on his shoulder and didn't answer. The man on the gray horse looked at the arrangement of women, at the men standing with them, at Elias Pratt with his pocket watch, and then his gaze moved to Brenna, standing alone in the mud with her bag at her feet, and it stayed there. He swung down off the horse in one motion that made no particular sound, handed the reins to a post that was nearby and presumably sturdy enough, walked forward through the mud that was everyone's shared problem today, and the crowd parted for him without anyone appearing to decide to do it. He stopped in front of Pratt. "Voss, bis buttons. Laws?" Pratt said, the way you'd say the name of a thunderstorm. "Pratt," the man said. His voice was low, roughened, the kind of voice that had spent years talking mostly to itself and had gotten comfortable with that. "I heard you brought women." Yes, that was the arrangement." "What's wrong with that one?" He didn't gesture toward Brenna. He just looked at her. Pratt opened his mouth and then, to his credit, seemed to realize there was no good answer to that question. Nothing's wrong with her. Then why is she still standing there? Silence. The drizzle continued. Somewhere, a horse shifted its weight. Brenna had been looked at her whole life in ways she didn't like, and she'd developed a response to it that was mostly controlled and occasionally wasn't. She looked back at the man named Voss steadily and said, before Pratt could answer for her, "Because nobody chose me. That's the plain fact of it." Voss looked at her for a long moment. There was something assessing in it that wasn't the same as what the men in the crowd had been doing. They'd been checking whether she fit an idea they had. This man seemed to be checking something else entirely, though she couldn't have said what. "Can you work hard?" he said. "Harder than most people who've asked me that question." "Can you handle cold?" "I'm Irish. I was born in weather that'd make this look like summer." Something moved at the edge of his mouth. She wasn't sure it was a smile exactly. It was the ghost of the idea of a smile, like the muscle remembered the motion without being fully committed to it. He turned back to Pratt. "What are the terms?" "The standard arrangement. But, Mr. Voss, I'm not sure." Pratt glanced at Brenna and then away again, and she understood that what he wasn't sure about was whether she would want to go with this particular man, and she found herself oddly grateful that he was at least thinking about it. "I choose that woman," Voss said, quietly, directly, as simple as pointing at a thing and naming it. The crowd remained very still. Brenna picked up her bag. His name was Ronan Voss, and the people of Black Hollow were afraid of him for reasons that turned out to be a mixture of genuine, exaggerated, and completely fabricated. She learned this gradually over the first mile of riding behind him up a mountain trail that she would later understand was the only real road to where he lived, and which wasn't much of a road by any serious definition. He'd offered her his horse without question. "You take the saddle, I'll walk." And she'd argued with him about it briefly and unsuccessfully, because he was already walking before she finished her sentence, and it turned out arguing with someone who wasn't listening required more effort than she had available after the day she'd had. So she rode and he walked, and the trail went up through pine trees that grew so close together the drizzle barely reached them, and occasionally she asked questions, and occasionally he answered them. "How far?" she asked. "Hour and a half in good weather." She looked at the sky. "And in this?" "2. "Right." She adjusted her grip on the reins. The horse was steadier than the wagon had been. "How long have you lived up here?" A pause before he answered, the kind that meant he was deciding how much of the answer to give. 7 years. "Alone?" "Yes." "By choice?" Another pause, longer. "Mostly." Brenna decided that was enough questions for the moment. She watched the trees and the trail and the way his shoulders moved as he walked, easy and unhurried, like a man who'd walked this particular route enough times that his body did it without his full attention. "Why'd you come to town today?" she asked after a while. He didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was matter of fact. "Needed salt. Heard Pratt's wagon was coming. Thought..." He stopped. "Thought what?" "Thought maybe." He said it like those were enough words, which she supposed they were. She thought about that for the rest of the climb. The lodge was not what she'd been prepared for. She'd prepared herself for something rough and dark, and smelling of a man who'd been alone too long. She'd prepared herself for bare walls and minimal furniture and the general atmosphere of a space that had given up on itself. She'd prepared herself, if she was being honest, for something closer to a cave than a home. What she got was a long, low building constructed with serious care from timber and stone, set into the side of the mountain like it had grown there, with a covered porch running the full length of the front and a view east toward a valley that was, even in the rain and fading light, remarkable. Inside, a main room with a stone fireplace big enough to stand in, a table and chairs that someone had made by hand and made well, shelves of books, real books, dozens of them, organized, read, a wood stove already banked for the night, and light from oil lamps that turned everything warm amber. Off the main room, a second room, separated by a solid door. "That's yours," Voss said, nodding at the door. "I'll take the loft." She pushed the door open. A bed with a proper frame, a chest at the foot of it, a window that looked out at pines. Quilt on the bed that had been made with attention. Not fancy, but not nothing. She turned around. He was standing by the wood stove, adding a log without looking at her. "You built all of this?" she said. "Over time." "And the books?" "Mostly ordered, some traded for." She looked at the shelves again. There were titles she recognized and titles she didn't. There was a section that appeared to be engineering manuals. There was a worn copy of David Copperfield that had clearly been read more than once. "You painted that," she said. It wasn't a question. There was a painting on the wall above the fireplace. The valley, in summer, pine green and full of light, done with a skill that surprised her. He didn't answer, which she took as confirmation. "Right," Brenna said. She set her bag down on the bed and stood in the room that was hers for a moment, getting her bearings. She was tired in a way that went below the surface. The day had scraped something out of her that would take time to fill back in. The mud and the rain, and the laughter, and the long walk of being looked at and not chosen. But she was here now. And here was not what she'd expected. That counted for something. She wasn't sure what yet, but something. The first week was awkward in the specific way that being strangers in close quarters is always awkward, where you're both aware of each other's movements and rhythms, and you haven't yet figured out which habits will grate and which you can live with. Voss rose before first light and went to work. He was expanding the root cellar, apparently a project long in progress, and was usually back at the lodge by midday, quiet, carrying whatever he'd accomplished in his hands, and the evidence of the morning's effort in the set of his shoulders. He cooked for himself because he always had, and the idea of waiting seemed not to occur to him, which Brenna initially found mildly irritating until she realized he wasn't excluding her. He just genuinely didn't think about it, and when she made it clear she'd like to be included in that particular arrangement, he adjusted without complaint. He ate what she cooked without commenting on it, which in Brenna's experience could mean anything from silent approval to the polite endurance of suffering. But when she made soda bread on the third day, something she'd been making since she was 9 years old and knew was good, he ate 3 pieces, and she took that as a review. She found a rhythm in the work. There was always work. A frontier homestead didn't have idle time built into it. There were always things that needed doing or fixing or improving. She took over the kitchen garden, which had been functional but neglected, and began putting it in order. She went through the pantry and the stores and made an accounting of what they had and what they'd need before the mountain roads became difficult in late fall, and she told him plainly what she'd determined. "You need another 50 pounds of flour at minimum, probably salt pork. Your lamp oil is going to run short if winter goes past February." He looked at the list she'd made. He'd come in from outside and was standing near the door still in his coat, reading her handwriting with the careful attention of someone who was taking it seriously. "I was going to make a supply run," he said. "Good. I'll add to it." He folded the paper and put it in his coat pocket. "You have a good hand," he said. "You're writing." It was such an ordinary thing to notice that it caught her off guard. She turned back to the stove. "My mother taught me. She believed in writing." "Where's she now?" "Dead. 7 years ago. Fever." He was quiet for a moment, then, "My mother died when I was 12. Same." He said it without the weight of an offering, just as a plain fact, one fact responding to another. Brenna nodded. "I'm sorry for it." "Yes," he said, which was not the same as "me too," but was close enough. Boom. She found the paintings on the 10th day. There was a storage room off the back of the lodge, behind a door she'd assumed was a closet, and when she opened it looking for spare nails, she found instead a room full of canvases. Dozens of them, stacked against the walls, some framed and some not. Landscapes, mostly. The mountain, the valley, the pines in different seasons and different light. But also other things, studies of objects, a hawk in flight captured in a few precise lines of charcoal, the creek in spring thaw, a pair of hands at rest. She stood in the doorway for a long time. She was still standing there when she heard him come in the back entrance and stop behind her. "I wasn't snooping," she said. "I was looking for nails." "Nails are in the tin on the left shelf." She looked. They were. "Thank you." She didn't move. "These are very good." He said nothing. "I don't mean it as flattery, I mean it as a fact. These are genuinely good. You have some kind of formal—" "No. Just time." He said time in a way that meant something heavier than the word alone. She thought about 7 years on a mountain alone, with enough time to fill the walls of a room with paintings and the shelves with books, and to build a house by hand to a standard that could be called, without exaggeration, fine. She thought about what you had to be running from or toward to build a life that looked like this. She took the nails and left the room and didn't mention the paintings again unless he brought them up first, which he didn't. Not right away. But she noticed he didn't close that door after that. He left it standing open the way you leave a door open when you've decided something. It was on the 14th day that she asked him directly, because she was not a person who could sustain the practice of not asking things she needed to know indefinitely. They were eating supper, venison she'd cooked with the dried herbs from the garden, better than the first time she'd done it because she'd learned the stove's temperament. And he was reading a page from something he'd been working through all week, and the lamp was putting good light on the table, and she thought, if not now, when? "Why did you choose me?" she said. He put down the page. He looked at her across the table with the expression she'd started to learn was his thinking face, the one that meant he was deciding how to answer something rather than whether to. "I told you," he said. "Nobody else had." "That's not an answer. It's a reason." "It's the outside of a reason," Brenna said. "There was a whole crowd of men who hadn't chosen me. You didn't see any of them step up." He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer further. Then he said, "You picked up that girl's bag." She blinked. "Cecily?" She had a bad ankle. "You didn't know her. You were tired and carrying your own. You picked up her bag anyway." He looked at his plate for a moment. "And when no one chose you, you didn't—" He stopped. "Didn't what?" "Didn't fall apart. Didn't make a scene. Just stood there like you were deciding what came next." He picked up his fork. "That's a kind of strength I know how to respect." Brenna sat with that for a moment. "That's a strange way to pick a wife," she finally said. "I'm a strange man," he said, without apology or self-pity, the same way he said most things, just as a plain accounting of fact. She found, to her surprise, that she didn't disagree with him. Strange was not the same as bad. She'd known bad, and it didn't look like this. It didn't look like a room full of paintings hidden in the back of a house built by hand. It didn't look like a man who read Dickens in the evening and got up before dawn to dig out a root cellar so they'd have enough food to get through winter. "All right," she said, and went back to her supper. "Hotel." The first sign of trouble was a stranger watching the lodge from the tree line. She saw him on the 18th day, in the late afternoon, when the light was doing that slanted thing through the pines that made long shadows across the ground. She was in the kitchen garden pulling the last of what could be salvaged before the first hard frost came, and she happened to look up, and there was a man standing in the trees about 200 yards out, not moving, watching. She finished what she was doing. She came inside. She waited until Voss came in from the workshop, and she said, without dramatizing it, "There was a man watching the lodge from the pine line, northeast side. Dark coat. He was there for at least 20 minutes. Voss went still in a way she hadn't seen from him before. Not alarmed exactly. It was more like a man whose machinery had just shifted into a different gear. "What did he look like?" he asked. Couldn't tell at that distance. Not local. Something about the way he was standing. She'd spent enough time watching people who were watching things they didn't want to be caught watching to know it when she saw it. Voss walked to the window and looked out at the tree line for a long time. The stranger was gone now. But the looking meant something. She could see it in his face, which was harder than usual. "Who is it?" she asked. He turned away from the window, sat down at the table, and then, in the matter-of-fact voice he used for most things, he began to tell her. Okam. It had started, as these things often did, with the land. 8 years ago, before he'd come to this mountain, before the lodge and the paintings and the years of solitude, Ronan Voss had been working survey work in the territories. It was good work for a man his size who was comfortable with hard country and could be trusted to be accurate, and he'd been good at it. He'd surveyed this mountain as part of a broader land assessment, and in the process of that survey, working down through a dry creek bed in late summer, he'd found something in the exposed rock face that he'd recognized immediately. Silver. A seam of it, running deep, wide enough and rich enough to be worth a considerable sum to anyone with the equipment and the will to extract it. He'd submitted his survey. He'd noted what he'd found. The report had gone to the Territorial Land Office, and then nothing had happened, which was unusual. He'd followed up twice. Nothing. He'd filed a private claim on the land himself, using savings he'd accumulated and the claim procedure that existed for exactly this kind of individual discovery. And then, because the mountain was beautiful and he was tired in a way that went past physical, he'd built a house on it and stayed. "The claim is yours?" Brenna said. "Has been for 7 years. And the silver?" "Still in the ground. I've never touched it." She looked at him. "Why not?" He considered this. "I didn't need it," he said finally, "and I'd seen what that kind of money does to places. I wasn't—" He stopped, started again. "I wanted to live here, not turn it into something else." Brenna nodded slowly. "But someone found out." "Someone found out," he exhaled. "Victor Harlan, mining out of Billings. He has claims across 4 territories, and he buys land the way other men buy cattle, constantly, in bulk, wherever he can get it cheap." His jaw tightened. "I got a letter from his attorney 3 months ago, offering to buy. And you declined." "I declined. And then?" "Then I got another letter." Less politely where Claude's response was interrupted. "Try again." "Then I got another letter, less politely worded." He said it and left it there, the way you leave a stone on a table and let the weight of it speak for itself. Brenna looked at the window, at the dark tree line beyond the glass, at the space where a stranger had been standing and watching for 20 minutes without announcing himself. She thought about the word less politely worded and what that meant when the man saying it was Ronan Voss, who had a high threshold for what qualified as a problem worth mentioning. "How many letters total?" she asked. 4. Then the lawyer showed up in person, came up the mountain trail in August, which means someone told him where to find the path. He paused. "Not many people know the path." "What did you tell him?" "Same thing I told the letters. The land isn't for sale." "And now there are men in the trees." "Now there are men in the trees," he agreed. She turned this over. The lodge felt different knowing it, the way a room feels different when you realize the walls are thinner than you thought. She looked at the shelves, the books, the painting above the fireplace. The valley in summer, green and full of light, painted by a man who'd chosen this place deliberately and stayed in it through 7 winters and meant to stay in more. "What does Harlan actually want?" she asked. "The silver or the land?" "Both." "You can't have one without the other." "And if he can't buy it?" Voss was quiet for a moment. "Then he'll try something else." She didn't ask him to be more specific, because she thought she understood well enough what something else meant when you were dealing with a man who had money and men and lawyers and the patience of someone who'd built an empire by getting what he wanted. "All right," she said, "then we need to know what we're working with." He looked at her. "We." "You chose me," she said. "That comes with the plural." Something shifted in his face. Not quite surprise. He wasn't a man who surprised easily, but something adjacent to it. Like a door he'd been expecting to stay closed had opened, not dramatically, just swung wide and let in air. "The claim papers," she said. "Do you have them here?" "In the strongbox under the floor in the back room." "And you filed them correctly? All the proper registrations with the Territorial Land Office?" "I'm a surveyor," he said, which was not a boast, just a fact. "I know how to file a claim." "Good." She folded her hands on the table. "Then the law is on your side. The question is whether the law can get to you faster than Harlan can." That was the shape of the problem, and they both knew it. The law in a territory like this was a thing with long legs and slow feet. Harlan's money moved faster than any court docket. Shit. The next morning she woke before him, which surprised her because she'd assumed he was congenitally incapable of sleeping past 4 in the morning. She built the fire up and made coffee and sat at the table with the claim papers he'd pulled from the strongbox the night before, reading through them carefully in the early light. The paperwork was meticulous. Whatever else Ronan Voss was, he was thorough. Every form properly signed, every date recorded, the original survey filed with his name attached, a full copy of the mineral rights documentation she didn't fully understand but which appeared to be comprehensive. There was also a letter from the Territorial Land Office dated 6 years ago, acknowledging receipt of his claim and issuing no objection. She was still reading when he came in from outside, boots tracked with the first real frost of the season, carrying an armful of firewood. You're reading my papers, he said. I'm reading our papers, she said. Come look at this. He set down the wood and came to the table, and she pointed at the land office letter. This is your strongest piece. This is the territorial government acknowledging your claim without challenge. Any lawyer Harlan brings is going to have to get past this. I know. Do you have a copy stored somewhere else? Away from the lodge? He hadn't thought of that. She could tell by the slight pause. No. We need to make copies and get them to someone trustworthy off the mountain. A lawyer, or at minimum someone in a town Harlan doesn't own. She looked at him steadily. If anything happens to these papers, nothing's going to happen to the papers. You had a stranger in the tree line yesterday watching this house. Do not tell me nothing's going to happen to the papers. He sat down across from her. He looked at the documents, then at her, with the expression of a man recalibrating something internal. There's a man in Grantham, he said slowly. 3 days east, Thomas Hale. He's a land attorney. We went to school together before. He stopped, started again. I trust him. Then we write to him, today, and we send copies. The nearest postal route is Black Hollow. She thought about that. Black Hollow, where she'd been laughed at in the street, where Elias Pratt had his little office, where 30 men had watched her stand in the mud. Is the postmaster trustworthy? Reasonably. Then we go to Black Hollow. He looked at her for a moment. You don't have to be part of this. Ronan. She used his first name deliberately, the first time she had, and she saw it land. Stop saying things like that. He was quiet for a moment. Then, all right. They went to Black Hollow 3 days later, which was how long it took to copy the relevant papers by hand. Brenna did most of it, her penmanship being better than his, which he acknowledged without embarrassment, and to prepare what she'd started thinking of as the dispatch package. Copies of the claim, the land office letter, a detailed written account of the letters from Harlan's attorney, the visit, and the watching stranger, all of it composed carefully in Brenna's hand and addressed to Thomas Hale of Grantham. The ride down the mountain was the first time Brenna had been on it in daylight going the other direction, and she found herself noticing things she'd been too exhausted and overwhelmed to register on the way up. The way the trail curved around a rock formation that had to be 40 feet high, all dark granite threaded with something pale she now knew to look at differently. The way the pines opened up at one point into a small clearing with a view west toward a range of mountains she didn't have names for yet. The creek crossing, low this time of year, where the horse stepped carefully over stones and Voss steadied her arm without being asked and released it the moment she had her balance. She noted all of these things. She was making a map in her mind of the place, the way you do when you've decided somewhere belongs to you. Black Hollow in the early morning was quieter than it had been on her arrival, which didn't take much. The saloon was closed. The general store was open. A woman Brenna didn't recognize was sweeping the step in front of what turned out to be the laundry. Heads turned when they rode in. She felt it. The particular quality of attention that a town gives to something unexpected, like a storm approaching from the wrong direction. Voss and a woman, together, on the same horse path coming down from the mountain. That was something Black Hollow hadn't seen before, and it processed it with the slow-turning attention of a place that didn't have a great deal of novelty to work with. She held her posture and looked straight ahead and did not give anyone the satisfaction of seeing her register their interest. Voss dismounted in front of the post office, which was also the land recorder's office, which was also, apparently, a small telegraph station, all of it run out of a cramped wooden building with a sign that had weathered to near illegibility. He tied the horse and held out a hand to help her down, and she took it, and when she was on the ground he didn't immediately let go. Might get some attention in there, he said quietly. Donahue, the postmaster, he's decent, but people talk. Let them, she said. He let go of her hand. Inside the postmaster was a compact man with a walrus mustache and the careful eyes of someone who'd been processing other people's business for long enough to understand the value of discretion. He looked at Voss with the particular expression of a man who'd known someone at a distance for years and was revising his understanding of that distance. Voss, he said, Donahue, need to post this. He set the package on the counter. Grantham, Thomas Hale, attorney. 3 days, weather holding. Donahue looked at the package, at Brenna, back at the package. Anything else? I need to know, Brenna said, stepping forward, whether you've had any inquiries. from men representing a Victor Harlan or Harlan Mining or any associated interest, about property in this area. Donahue's mustache twitched. He looked at Voss. "She asks her own questions," Voss said. Donahue turned back to Brenna with a look that was reassessing her. "There were 2 men through here about 6 weeks back," he said slowly, asking general questions about land claims in the area, whether there were any active disputes. I directed them to the land recorder's files, which are public. Did they look at the files? They did. And then? And then they left. I don't know where they went." He paused. "I didn't care for them, if that's relevant." "It might be," Brenna said. "Thank you." She glanced at Voss. "Anything else you need while we're here?" "Salt," he said, "and lamp oil." She nodded. They went to the general store. It was coming out of the general store that she ran into the woman from the wagon. Not Cecily, Harriet, the one with the needlework credentials, who'd been claimed by the merchant. Harriet was a serious-faced woman in her mid-30s who'd said very little on the wagon journey and who Brenna had consequently assumed was either shy or reserved or possibly both. She was neither, it turned out. She was simply economical with words until she decided they were worth spending. "Miss Keegan," she said on the store step. Then with a quick look at Voss loading supplies onto the horse. "Mrs. Voss, I suppose now." "Brenna is fine," Brenna said. "Harriet?" "Yes." She looked at Brenna with a directness that was refreshing after the sideways attention of the rest of the town. "Are you well? Honestly?" "Honestly," Brenna said. "Yes." "Better than I expected." "You're not—" Harriet seemed to search for the right framing. He's not, Brenna said, understanding the question. "He's a strange man, but he's not that kind of strange." Harriet exhaled something that might have been relief. "Some of the women were worried after you left with him." "I appreciate that." She meant it. "Tell them I'm well." "I will." Harriet glanced again at Voss, who was pointedly not looking at them and therefore almost certainly listening. "There's been talk, men coming through town asking questions about the mountain land. My husband said they came into the store twice." Brenna kept her face level. "What kind of men?" "The kind with money and no visible occupation. You know the type." Harriet's mouth pressed thin. "My husband told them he didn't know anything about it, which is true, and they didn't come back. But it seemed like something you should know." "It is," Brenna said. "Thank you, Harriet, genuinely." They rode out of Black Hollow with the salt and the lamp oil and the knowledge that Harlan's people had been in the town before the watching man had appeared in the tree line, which meant the watching man wasn't the beginning of this. He was somewhere in the middle of it. Winter came to the mountain the way it always did at that elevation, not gradually, but in a series of increasingly serious warnings, followed by an event that made the warnings seem understated. First frost, then hard frost, then a week of gray skies that sat on the mountain like a lid, then the snow. And the snow was not the gentle, picturesque kind. It was the kind that had opinions. It changed the shape of everything. The trail to town became impassable, except in specific conditions that Voss knew how to read and Brenna was learning. The work shifted inward, tending the animals they'd brought up before the first serious snowfall, maintaining the woodpile, the constant management of temperature in a stone building at altitude, which was not as simple as it looked. It also left them, for stretches, with nowhere to be but in each other's company. No strangers in the trees, because nothing sensible moved through 3 feet of snow in weather that meant business. The threat was still out there. They both knew it. The letter from Thomas Hale that arrived in late November confirmed it, detailing what he'd uncovered about Harlan's recent land acquisitions, and the methods he'd employed in 2 other territories. But out here, under this weight of winter, it was abstract in a way it hadn't been. What was not abstract was the dailiness of living together. She learned that he ground his teeth in his sleep. He learned that she talked to the garden plants in Irish when she thought no one was listening, low and conversational, the way you'd talk to something that couldn't answer back but might still appreciate being addressed. She learned that he had a temper, but not the dangerous kind. It was the kind that manifested as a longer-than-usual silence, and a tendency to leave the room rather than say something he'd regret. She learned this after the morning she suggested reorganizing the workshop storage, and he disagreed sharply and then went outside for 40 minutes and came back and said, in the voice of a man who'd had a conversation with himself and reached a resolution, "The east wall storage stays where it is. The north side, you can reorganize." "That's what I originally suggested," she pointed out. "I know," he said. "I was wrong." She found it was hard to stay irritated with someone who said I was wrong the same way they said everything else. Straight, plain, no decoration. He learned that she cried once, briefly, in the workshop when she thought he was out on the far side of the property and couldn't hear. He didn't ask her about it, and she didn't volunteer it, but the next morning he'd put a cup of coffee on her side of the table already made, the way she took it, without her having to get up. And she understood that was his way of saying, "I heard, and it's all right, and here's something small I can do." He was building something in the workshop through the winter months, working at it in the evenings after supper, and he was private about it in a way that she respected without difficulty, because she understood having work that was yours before it was ready to be anyone else's. In January, during a storm that lasted 4 days and made the windows opaque with driven snow, they talked for the first time about where they'd each come from in the way that isn't practical information, but the other kind. She told him about Cork, about the farm and the crossing to Boston, and the 4 years in the laundries and the gray winters that accumulated in her chest like a debt she couldn't pay off. She told him about her father, who was still alive and still on the farm, and who she wrote to but who she suspected would not write back, because he'd made clear when she left that leaving was the kind of decision you didn't get to come back from. He told her about his own father, also still living, somewhere in Pennsylvania, who Ronan had stopped making contact with after an event he described only as a disagreement that turned permanent, and she didn't press it, because she recognized the particular flatness in his voice that meant the thing beneath the words was something that had been considered carefully and decided about, and she had enough respect for his decisions to let them stand. He told her he'd been engaged once, 7 years ago, before the mountain. A woman named Clara, not the Clara from the wagon, a different Clara, who'd ended the engagement after the surveying accident that had left the scar on his face, and he said with the careful neutrality of a man who'd spent years examining a thing and accepting it, had decided that she didn't want to be the wife of a man who looked like that. Brenna was quiet for a moment. The storm was loud against the windows. The fire was doing its best. "She was a fool," she said. "She was practical," he said. "The way people are when they're making a decision about the rest of their life. I can't fault her for it." "I can," Brenna said. "A scar is just a scar." He looked at her across the table. Something in the lamplight caught the pale line along his jaw, and she held his gaze without looking away from it because she wanted to be clear. He looked away first, at his hands, the fire, something in the middle distance. "What made you choose the mountain?" she asked. "Specifically this mountain, I mean. You could have gone anywhere." He was quiet for a while, long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then, "I'd been surveying 2 years by then, seen a lot of country. Most of it was being claimed and divided and changed as fast as men could manage it." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "This mountain, when I surveyed it, it had been left alone. Not because people hadn't noticed it, but because it was difficult and they'd moved on to easier things. And I thought—" He stopped. "What?" "I thought that was something worth protecting." She nodded slowly. She understood that. Not philosophically, but viscerally. The specific value of a thing that had been left alone, that hadn't been used up yet, that still had the capacity to be something rather than a record of what it had been. "Harlan's not going to stop," she said, not as a question. "No," Voss agreed. "He's not." "Then we can't either." He looked at her again, and this time neither of them looked away. Outside, the storm pressed against the glass and the fire threw its uncertain warmth, and the mountain held its ground the way it always had, indifferent to what men wanted from it, persistent in simply being what it was. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. She didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say that the gesture didn't already contain. His hand turned over under hers, just slightly, just enough. They sat like that until the fire needed tending. Thomas Hale's second letter arrived in February, tucked inside a supply delivery Voss had arranged with a man who ran a mule train through the lower passes when the weather allowed it. The letter was longer than the first one, and Brenna read it twice standing at the table before she handed it to Voss without comment, because she thought he should have the full experience of it without her face telling him what to feel about it first. He read it standing, She watched him read it and watched his jaw tighten on the third paragraph and stay that way. Hale had done his work thoroughly. What he'd uncovered about Victor Harlan was not surprising exactly, but it was worse in its specifics than the general shape of it had been. Harlan had done this before, twice in the Wyoming Territory, once in Colorado, and the method was consistent enough to be called a practice. He identified land with mineral value, made an offer, and when the offer was declined, he began a campaign of legal pressure and manufactured controversy designed to make the property owner's claim appear uncertain or their character appear questionable, until they either sold or abandoned the fight from exhaustion. In Wyoming, the second case, he'd gone further. He'd had a man arrested on fabricated charges serious enough to remove him from his property for 6 weeks, during which time Harlan's people had occupied the land under a disputed secondary claim. And by the time the charges were dismissed, the cost of reclaiming the property through the courts had bankrupted the original owner. Hale's letter ended with a recommendation and a warning in that order. The recommendation was to establish witnesses and documentation that would make any attempt to challenge the claim expensive in public. The warning was that Harlan was not a patient man, and the fact that he'd been refused twice and had men watching the property suggested he was moving toward a more direct approach. "I cannot tell you with certainty what form that approach will take," Hale had written, "but based on what I know of this man's previous conduct, I would urge you not to wait for him to show you." Voss set the letter down on the table. He looked at it for a moment without speaking. "He's right," Brenna said. "I know he's right." "Then what do we do about it?" He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down heavily, like a man setting down a weight he'd been carrying for a while. "I've been thinking about this since December, since the watcher in the trees." He folded his hands on the table. "The lodge can be defended. The approaches are limited. The main trail is the only practical access in winter, and in spring the east path is a secondary option, but it's narrow and steep and doesn't favor large groups." She looked at him. "You've been planning a defense." "I've been thinking about one. There's a difference." "Not a significant one." She leaned forward. "What else?" "I've been building something in the workshop." She'd known about the workshop project since November. She'd respected the privacy of it. She made a gesture that meant, "And?" "Bar reinforcements for the shutters. Both doors. The hinges on the front are heavy enough already, but the back needed work." He said it the same way he said everything. Measured, precise, but she could hear the thing underneath it, which was that a man who'd built this house for peace had spent 3 months quietly preparing it for something else, and that cost was visible if you looked. "I've also been stacking stone along the north window. If we needed cover there, there's a natural position." Brenna sat with this. "You've been doing all of this without telling me. I didn't want to keep—" He stopped. "Frighten me?" "No?" He seemed to consider the right word. "Decide it for you, that this was the fight you were staying for." She looked at him across the table for a long moment. Outside, the February wind moved through the pines, and the lodge made its sounds. The particular creaks and settlements of a building in cold weather that she'd learned to read like a language over the past months. "Ronan," she said, "I'm still here." "I know. I was still here when the first letter came. I was still here when we found out what Harlan did in Wyoming. I'm still here reading Hale's letter with you." She put her hand flat on the table between them. "You chose me because I picked up a bag and didn't fall apart. Well, I'm not falling apart now either." He looked at her hand, then at her. "All right," he said. "All right," she agreed. "Tell me what we still need to do." What they still needed to do turned out to be considerable, and the doing of it carried them through the rest of February and into a March that came in cold and suspicious and refused to commit to anything resembling spring. They wrote letters. This was Brenna's primary contribution to the preparation, and she took it seriously enough that she requisitioned most of the good paper and spent evenings at the table while Voss worked in the workshop, composing correspondence that she thought of privately as building walls with words. She wrote to the Territorial Land Commissioner's office, a formal letter documenting the claim, the refused offers, the watching stranger, and the information from Hale's inquiry. She wrote it in the clean, careful prose of someone who had spent 4 years in Boston reading every piece of paper that came into the laundry by way of clients' coat pockets and had developed a solid understanding of how official language worked and what it responded to. She was not dramatic. She was precise. She wrote to the newspaper in Grantham, a shorter letter framed as a citizen's account of mining interests attempting to pressure private landowners in the territory. She'd talked to Voss about this one, and he'd been initially resistant. "A newspaper," he'd said. "A newspaper," she confirmed. "That's—" He'd searched for the word. "Public." That's the point. He hadn't been comfortable with it, because he was a man who'd built a life specifically designed to be unobserved, and the idea of inviting observation was viscerally wrong to him in a way she understood was not stubbornness but something deeper. She'd waited him out. "Harlan operates where there's no attention," she'd said when his silence had stretched long enough. "He's done it before. Twice in Wyoming, once in Colorado, all of it quiet because the people he went after were isolated and had no one watching on their behalf." She'd looked at him steadily. "We're not isolated, or we don't have to be." He'd looked at the window for a while. "All right," he'd finally said. "Write it." She also wrote to Harriet's husband, the merchant in Black Hollow, a careful letter that framed itself as a request for general information about commercial activity in the territory and happened to mention, almost in passing, the names of the men who'd come through his store asking questions. She wanted a record of that, and she wanted it held by someone who could corroborate it if needed. And then, because she was thorough, and because something in Hale's letter about the Wyoming case had lodged in her mind and stayed there, she wrote a letter she didn't tell Voss about until it was already posted. She told him over supper on a Tuesday. "I wrote to the sheriff's office in Laramie," she said, "about the Wyoming case, the man who was arrested on fabricated charges." Voss set down his fork. "Why?" "Because if Harlan tries that here, I want to already have a relationship with someone who's seen him do it before and can speak to it." She picked up her own fork. "His name was Martin Dell. He lost his property, but he's still alive, and according to Hale's letter, he was willing to speak about what happened. I asked if he'd be willing to put it in writing." Voss was looking at her with an expression she'd started to recognize, the one that appeared when she'd done something he hadn't anticipated and was recalibrating. "You did that without telling me," he said. "I knew you'd have opinions about it that would slow the process down," she said. "I was right, weren't I?" A long pause. "Possibly. The letter's already gone. We can discuss it now if you want." He was quiet for a moment, then, "What did you say to him, Dell?" "The truth, that a man named Harlan was applying the same pressure here that he'd applied there, and that if it came to a fight in court or in front of a land commissioner, the account of a previous victim would carry weight." Voss picked up his fork again, ate, considered. "That was smart," he said finally. "I know," she said, and didn't make a production of it. Spring broke properly in late March, which meant the trail down the mountain became navigable, which meant Harlan's people had options they hadn't had in 3 months of serious winter. Brenna felt the shift like a change in atmospheric pressure. The mountain was beautiful in the thaw, all that frozen stillness releasing itself in the sound of water moving under the snow and the smell of wet earth and pine needles warmed by the first real sun since October. She would have liked to simply experience that beauty without the particular alertness that had become her second skin since Hale's letter. She didn't get to. The first stranger appeared on the east path on a Thursday in early April, not watching from the trees this time, walking, openly, dressed in a way that was meant to suggest ordinary travel. He had a companion who stayed back at the tree line, which was the detail that told you everything about what kind of ordinary travel this was. Voss was in the workshop when she came to get him. She didn't run, but she walked fast. "2 men," she said from the door. "One coming up the east path, one holding back. The one coming up is making himself visible on purpose." He set down what he was doing. He picked up his rifle from the rack by the door, not theatrically, just the way you pick up a tool you might need, and came outside. The man on the east path had the look of someone who'd practiced seeming harmless and almost achieved it. He was in his 40s, clean-shaven, wearing a coat that was good quality and slightly wrong for the territory, the way clothes are when they've been purchased to fit an occasion rather than grown into it. He stopped when he saw them, raised his hand in a gesture that was meant to communicate friendly. "Mr. Voss," he said when he was close enough, "my name is Garfield. I represent the interests of Harlan Mining." "I know who you represent," Voss said. His voice was level. He held the rifle in a way that was not threatening and not threatening. I've been asked to make a final offer for the property, Garfield said. He had the practiced ease of a man who'd had doors closed in his face many times and had learned how to keep talking anyway. Mr. Harlan is prepared to be generous. Given the remoteness of the location and the current state of the title isn't in any state, Brenna said. It's registered, documented, and confirmed by the Territorial Land Office. There's nothing current about it. Garfield looked at her with the particular expression of a man who'd expected to be dealing with one person and was adjusting to the reality of two. Mrs. Voss, he said, which was an assumption she didn't correct. I don't think you fully appreciate the complexity of the situation. I appreciate it completely, she said. The situation is that your employer has attempted twice by letter, once in person, and now again to purchase property that is not for sale. Our answer hasn't changed. She met his eyes directly. It won't change. Garfield shifted his weight. He was recalibrating. She could see it, figuring out the angle that worked on a woman who was looking at him like that. There are questions, he said slowly, about certain aspects of the original survey documentation. The manner in which the mineral rights were attached to the land claim. There are no questions, Voss said. The survey was conducted by me. The documentation was filed correctly. The Land Commissioner's office has acknowledged the claim without objection. He took a step forward that was not large but was sufficient. You're aware of all of this because your employer's lawyers have been over every page of it. The questions don't exist. You're telling me they exist to see if I'll react like they do. A silence stretched between them on the spring mountain. Birds somewhere in the pines. Water moving in the creek below. Garfield put his hat back on his head. The practiced ease was still there, but it was covering something now. Mr. Harlan isn't a man who takes no for a final answer, he said. It was said quietly, evenly, the way you deliver a weather report. Neither am I, Voss said. Garfield left the way he'd come, back down the east path to the companion waiting in the trees, and they didn't watch him go. There was no point. He'd delivered his message, and they'd delivered theirs, and what came next would not be negotiation. Brenna turned back to the lodge. Her hands were steady, but she could feel her heart in her chest more than usual. He'll report back, she said. Yes, and then Harlan will decide. Yes. She stopped at the door and turned around. Voss was still looking at the east path, at the tree line where Garfield's companion had been standing and wasn't anymore. His face had the particular stillness of a man looking at a thing he'd been expecting and finding it exactly as bad as anticipated. The offer was a last step, she said. Hale said that in his letter. In Wyoming, the offer came right before the escalation. I know. Then we should assume we don't have much time. He turned toward her. In the April light, with the mountains still half snow around them and the thaw moving through the air, he looked like what he was. A man who'd chosen a difficult place deliberately and intended to hold it, and who was old enough to understand what that cost. The shutters are done, he said. The doors. I finished the north window reinforcement last week. I know you did. She held his gaze. I want you to show me how to use the rifle properly. He'd shown her the basics in January, a brief practical lesson she'd asked for, and he'd provided without comment. She knew how to load it, how to hold it, how to fire. She did not know how to do those things well under the particular conditions that were coming. You're sure, he said. I'm sure. He nodded. Tomorrow morning, then. Early. While the light's good. Pop. She learned faster than he expected. This didn't surprise her. She'd always been a quick study with anything that required her full attention, and she was paying full attention. But she could tell it surprised him a little, the way he recalibrated the instruction each time she mastered a step faster than he'd allotted for. By the end of the second session, she could load, aim, and fire with accuracy at a reasonable distance, and could do it without the flinch response that she'd had to train herself out of, which was mostly a matter of repetition and the particular stubbornness that had served her in every other difficult situation she'd faced. You're not bad at this, he said, on the third morning. I'm not bad at most things I decide to do, she said, and meant it without arrogance. It was simply a thing she'd noticed about herself, that the deciding was most of it. They had approximately 10 days before what came next arrived. They didn't know it was 10 days. But the mountain had its own intelligence about incoming weather, and Voss had spent 7 years learning to read it, and Brenna was learning fast enough. What came first, before the men with intentions, was a letter. It arrived by way of the mule train courier in the second week of April, written on legal stationery from an attorney in Helena, addressed formally to Ronan Voss, and making a claim she'd been half expecting since Hale's letter and half hoping wouldn't materialize. The letter stated that Harlan Mining had filed a challenge to the original land claim, asserting procedural irregularities in the initial survey documentation, and was seeking a territorial commissioner's review that would temporarily suspend Voss's right to occupy the property pending investigation. She read it standing at the table. She set it down. She picked it up and read it again. Then she went to the workshop because she needed 2 minutes alone to be angry before she could be useful. And she stood in the workshop with her hands flat on Voss's workbench and breathed through it. The specific fury of watching a lie construct itself in legal language, dressed in the clothes of procedure, all the forms correct and the substance rotten. When she came back inside, Voss was reading the letter. "It's not legitimate," she said from the doorway. "I know." His voice was flat. "But it doesn't need to be legitimate to cause problems. A commissioner's review takes time, and while it's pending, they'll try to establish a physical presence here that makes the claim look contested." She came to the table. "This is what he did in Wyoming." "I know." He set the letter down. His jaw was tight. "We need to send word to Hale. Immediately. I'm already composing it in my head." She pulled out the paper. "Sit down. Tell me exactly what the original survey filing said about the mineral rights attachment. The precise language. I want Hale to be able to cite it word for word when he responds to this." He sat down. He told her the language, and she wrote it, and outside the April mountain continued its thaw, indifferent and unhurrying, while inside the lodge a woman who'd been brought here by a stranger in the mud of a frontier town worked the only real defense she had: paper, ink, and the specific determination of someone who had not come this far to be moved. She sealed the letter. She looked at Voss across the table. "They'll come before a commissioner gets here," she said. "That's how this works. They manufacture the legal uncertainty, and then they move under cover of it." "Yes," he said. "How long do you think we have?" He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the window, at the south-facing glass that caught the most light, that looked toward the trail. "A week," he said. "Maybe 10 days. She nodded. She folded her hands on the table. "Then we use every one of them." They used every one of those days. Voss worked from before first light until he couldn't see to work anymore, and Brenna worked alongside him or parallel to him, and they didn't discuss what they were preparing for in the abstract because there was no point. It had moved past the stage of discussion into the stage of doing, and doing required all the attention they had. The bar reinforcements went on every shutter. The front door got a second brace, a heavy timber fitted into iron brackets that Voss had forged himself in the small forge behind the workshop. And when he set it in place for the first time and threw his weight against the door from outside, it didn't move by a fraction. He tested it 3 times. The door held each time. He didn't say anything about it. He moved to the next thing. Brenna reorganized the interior of the lodge with the specific logic of someone planning for a situation where movement would be restricted and visibility would matter. The table went against the wall, the chairs arranged so that neither window was fully in line of sight from the other. The water barrel she moved from the back room to the main room, because if they were inside for an extended period, access to water needed to be simple. She also packed 2 bags, one for each of them, essentials only, tucked behind the false panel in the back room that she'd discovered by accident and that Voss confirmed had been intentional, built in when the lodge was constructed, because he was a man who'd always understood at some level that having a way out was not pessimism, but plain sense. The bags were not for running. They were for the possibility that running became necessary, which was a different thing. She did not tell him about the 3rd document she'd prepared and sealed in an oilskin pouch tucked into the lining of her own bag. It was a full account, detailed, dated, in her clearest hand, of everything that had happened from the moment Garfield came up the east path to the letter from Helena. It named names. It described events specifically. It was the kind of document that, if something happened to the lodge and to them, would exist somewhere outside of Harlan's reach to find. She'd given a copy to the mule train courier on his last pass, with instructions and enough money to ensure it reached Hale. She'd given another copy to someone else, by way of a letter she'd written in 3 parts, and posted on 3 separate days to avoid drawing attention to the volume of her correspondence. Voss found the original draft on the table on the 6th day. He read it without asking permission, which she didn't mind because she'd left it where he'd find it, which was its own kind of telling. When he finished, he set it down carefully, like it was something fragile. When did you write this? Started the night after Garfield came. Finished the night we got the Helena letter. He was quiet. You didn't mention it? I was going to, when it was ready. She was at the stove. She kept her back to him while she said the next part because she thought eye contact might make it harder. I wanted you to know that if this goes wrong, if we lose, the story doesn't disappear with us. Someone will know what happened. Someone will have it on paper with names and dates and no room for Harlan to rewrite it. He was quiet for long enough that she turned around. He was looking at the document. His face had the particular quality of a man confronting something he'd been afraid of in a form he hadn't anticipated. And what he hadn't anticipated was that someone had already thought past his fear and done something practical about it without needing him to manage it first. He stopped. Practical, she said, the word she'd used before. Yes. He set the document down gently. He looked at her directly. Thank you. She turned back to the stove. Don't thank me yet. Let's see how it turns out first. They came on a Tuesday night. She heard them before she saw them, or rather, she heard what their arrival displaced, which was the specific quality of night sound on the mountain. She'd been awake. She wasn't sure she'd slept at all. She'd been lying in the dark listening to the lodge settle and the wind move through the pines, and at some point, close to midnight, the night went wrong in a way she felt before she could name it. The birds stopped. Not gradually, the way birds go quiet when a storm front moves through. All at once, like a switch. She was out of bed before she'd fully decided to be. She crossed to the window in her socks and looked out and saw nothing. Just the dark and the tree line and the thin slice of moon that was doing very little for visibility. And then she saw the movement, low and deliberate, at the edge of the clearing that surrounded the lodge's south approach. She crossed the main room in the dark, not touching anything, moving by memory, and went up the 3 steps to the loft where Voss slept. She put her hand on his shoulder. He was already awake. I know, he said, quiet. I heard it. South clearing, at least 2, possibly more on the east side. He was already moving. He'd slept in his clothes, which she'd only noticed when she thought about it afterward. At the time it had seemed ordinary, part of the general calculus of what they were expecting. They positioned without speaking because they'd talked through this enough in the past 6 days that talking again now would only be noise. Voss to the front with the rifle, covering the main door and the south window. Brenna to the back room with the second rifle and the angle on the east window, which was the secondary approach Garfield had used and which she thought they'd use again because it was narrower and offered cover along the path. She got to the east window and looked out and counted 3 shapes in the shadows at the edge of the pines. One of them was moving toward the workshop. Ronan, she said, low. The workshop. A pause from the front room. I see it. The workshop held the forging tools, the timber work, the stored fuel for the forge. It was built separate from the lodge for exactly the reasons that now became relevant. It was flammable in a way the stone lodge was not, but it shared the north wall of the outbuilding with a storage room that connected by a covered walkway. She heard the sound, the particular wet sound of something liquid being poured onto wood, and then she smelled it. Oil. They were going to burn the workshop. They're going to fire the workshop, she said. I know. His voice had gone very flat. Stay at the east window. Do not let anyone reach the walkway door. She pressed herself to the wall beside the window, not directly in the frame, the way he'd told her, and she watched the shape at the workshop move and heard the scrape of a match. A small sound, tremendous in the dark, and then the orange light started at the base of the workshop wall and began to climb. A second shape was moving toward the front of the lodge. She could hear it in the sound of the footsteps, the crunch of spring ground. Then the front door took a hit that shook the whole wall of the lodge, something heavy, a ram of some kind, or a man's shoulder with enough mass behind it. And the brace held. The timber bracket Voss had forged and set and tested 3 times held, and she heard a man's voice outside say again, and the door took another hit. There are at least 4, Voss said from the front room. His voice was controlled. Possibly 5. The door is holding. The workshop was burning now. She could see the orange light at the corner of her window frame and feel the particular quality of air that burning at night produces, warmer and smelling of char. "Someone's going to come around to the east when the workshop gets hot enough," she said. "I know. Be ready." She was already ready. Her hands weren't shaking. She noted this with some distant part of her mind, not with pride exactly, but with the particular calm clarity that comes when a thing you've been afraid of becomes simply a thing that is happening and must be dealt with. The shape came around the corner of the burning workshop exactly when she'd expected it to, using the light and chaos as cover, moving fast, crouched low, heading for the walkway door. She fired once. The shape dropped to one knee, not hit, but startled. She'd aimed deliberately wide, the warning that precedes the consequence. And she levered the rifle and said through the window, loud enough to carry, "The next one finds you." The shape scrambled back into the dark. From the front of the lodge, the door took a third hit, and this time she heard something crack. Not the door, but the frame around it, the wood giving slightly, and she heard Voss say something short and hard under his breath. Then a voice came from outside the front, a voice she didn't recognize, carrying the particular authority of someone who'd been given lines to deliver and believed in them. "Voss? By the authority of the Harlan Mining Company and the petition filed before the Territorial Land Commission, you are ordered to vacate this property pending review. You have 5 minutes to come out peaceable." Brenna walked from the east window to the doorway between the back room and the main room and looked at Voss. He was at the south window, and in the orange light from the burning workshop she could see his face clearly, set hard, jaw tight, the expression of a man who has passed the stage of weighing options because he'd weighed them already. "Authority of the Harlan Mining Company," she said. "Yes. That's not a legal authority. They're counting on us not knowing that." She looked at the south window. Outside, the workshop fire had reached the roof. "Are you going to answer him?" Voss looked at her. "Are you?" She walked to the front window, staying to the side of the frame. She put her voice into the space between the wall and the shutter, not shouting, but carrying. "This is Mrs. Voss. The Harlan Mining Company holds no jurisdiction over this property or any other. The claim you are referencing is a fabricated legal challenge, and the men who advised you to use it as grounds for a forced removal have exposed you to criminal liability for what you're doing right now." A pause. She made herself breathe. "The Territorial Land Commissioner's Office has been notified. A land attorney in Grantham has copies of all relevant documentation. 2 newspapers have been contacted. There are witnesses to every threat made against this property. What you are doing right now is not operating in the dark." Silence from outside, just the fire. Then the voice again, less certain now. "You have 5 minutes." "You had 1 warning," Brenna said. "You've used it." Another hit on the door. The crack in the frame widened, she could hear it, but the brace held, and she understood now viscerally what Voss had built, what those 3 tests of his own weight against the door had meant. He'd built this door to survive exactly this, and it was surviving it. From outside, she heard voices talking to each other, not audible enough to make out words. She heard footsteps moving, relocating, she thought, reorganizing. "They're moving to the east," she said, and went back to the east window. What followed was not clean or organized or anything like the stories people tell afterward about dramatic confrontations. It was 40 minutes of cold and firelight, and the smell of burning timber and the specific endurance of waiting in the dark, not knowing exactly what was coming and from where. It was 2 more attempts on the east walkway door, the second one serious enough that she fired, and this time not wide, catching the doorframe above the man's reaching hand, and the sound of that shot in the confined space of the back room left her ears ringing for an hour. It was Voss firing once from the south window, a warning shot that she heard but didn't see, and the sound of someone retreating fast through underbrush. It was the workshop burning itself out on the stone foundation, all the timber gone, the roof collapsed in on itself. The forged tools and the winter's work reduced to a specific rubble. She would walk through 2 days later with a sick feeling in her chest that she allowed herself for 10 minutes before she started cataloging what could be salvaged. It was the moment around 2 in the morning when the sounds outside changed, became movement rather than presence. The sounds of people deciding to leave rather than deciding to stay. And she called across to Voss, "They're pulling back." "I hear it." She stayed at the east window until she could hear nothing at all. Then she went to the front room and stood beside him, and they both looked out the south window at the clearing, which was empty, which held nothing now but the last orange glow of the workshop ruins and the ordinary dark of an April night on a mountain in Montana. Her legs were trembling. She hadn't noticed until just now, when there was nothing requiring her legs to do anything in particular. She sat down on the floor with her back against the wall. Just sat down. Not dramatic, just her legs making a decision independent of her. Voss looked at her. "I'm fine," she said. "I know." He slid down the wall and sat beside her. Their shoulders touched. He didn't move away. Neither did she. They sat there in the dark while the workshop finished burning, and neither of them said anything for a long time. And that was all right. They went through it in the daylight, and the daylight was better and worse simultaneously. Better because you could see, worse because you could see. The workshop was a total loss. Roof collapsed, all the stored timber burned through, the workbench reduced to its iron fittings. The forge itself was stone and iron, and had survived, blackened but intact, which Voss stood in front of for a while before he said anything. "The tools are mostly salvageable," he said finally. "Yes," she agreed, though she'd counted the canvas covers on the painting supplies and found them partially scorched and was carrying that particular loss carefully. The east walkway door had taken real damage. The frame cracked through, the hinges pulled partly from the stone, and the front door frame needed work before the front brace would seat properly again. She found boot marks in the mud around the south side of the lodge, a pattern of 4 distinct sets that told her there'd been at least 4 men, which matched what they'd estimated. She also found, caught on the lower hinge of the east walkway door, a piece of fabric torn from a coat that she collected without explanation and put in her pocket because it was the kind of thing that was evidence. Inside the lodge, remarkably, was undamaged. The stone walls had done what stone walls are built to do. The windows were intact, the floor, the furniture, the shelves of books, untouched. Voss stood in the middle of the main room for a moment, looking at it. She watched him take it in, the ordinary interior of the life he'd built, unbroken. "They expected us to leave," she said. "That was the plan. Fire the workshop, make enough noise at the doors, and we'd either come out or run." "Yes," he said. "They didn't expect 2 people who knew what they were walking into." He looked at her. "No," he said. "They didn't." She picked up the fabric from her pocket and set it on the table. "We need to go to Black Hollow. Today, if the horses are in condition. We need to file a report with whatever passes for law in that town. And we need to send another letter to Hale with a full account of last night. And we need to talk to the postmaster about the telegraph." She pulled out the chair and sat down. Her body ached from the night in a way she was only now fully feeling. The cold and the tension and the sitting on the floor that she was too old for. "Can you ride?" He'd caught a scrape along his forearm in the second assault on the east door. Nothing serious, but real, and she'd wrapped it that morning with the practicality of someone who'd bandaged worse. He looked at it now like he'd forgotten it was there. "I can ride." "Good." She put her hands flat on the table. "Because Harlan's going to hear about last night, and when he does, he's going to make a decision about what comes next. I want to be already moving before he makes it." Voss sat down across from her. He had the look of a man who'd been braced for something heavy and was recalibrating to the discovery that the weight was distributed differently than expected, that some of it had been picked up and was being carried by someone else. "You know," he said slowly, "when I rode into Black Hollow that day—" "Don't," she said. "I'm going to say it anyway." He looked at her steadily. "When I rode into Black Hollow and saw you standing there, I didn't know what I was doing. I only knew it seemed wrong, what was happening. I thought I was doing you a favor." She waited. "I understand now that I had it backward," he said. "You've been doing me one." She looked at him across the table for a moment. Outside, the April mountain was going about its business. Birds returning to the trees now that the smoke had cleared, the creek running hard with snowmelt, the pines doing what pines do. The workshop was gone. The door frame needed work. There was a long road still ahead of them. "Well," she said, "we can sort out who owed who what once this is finished." She pushed back from the table and stood. "Get the horses ready. I'll bring the documents." He stood, paused. "Brenna." She was already moving toward the back room. She stopped and looked over her shoulder. "Whatever happens next," he said, "I'm glad you're here." She held his gaze for a moment. "So am I," she said. And she meant it without reservation, which was something she hadn't been certain of on the day she'd picked up her bag and left Black Hollow with a stranger, but was entirely certain of now. She went to get the documents. He went to get the horses. Outside, the mountain held its ground. They rode into Black Hollow looking like what they were. Two people who had been through something the night before and hadn't slept and weren't done yet. Brenna had done nothing to make herself presentable beyond washing her face and pinning her hair back, because there was no time, and also because she'd decided some time ago that how she looked was not the most important thing about her, and the residents of Black Hollow could manage their own opinions about it. Voss rode beside her this time rather than walking, and the gray horse and Brenna's borrowed mare moved down the mountain trail at a pace that communicated purpose without being reckless on wet spring ground. The postmaster, Donahue, took one look at them when they came through his door and said, "What happened?" "Men from Harlan Mining fired our workshop and attempted a forced entry last night," Brenna said. She set the oilskin document pouch on his counter. "I need to send a telegraph, two, actually. One to Thomas Hale in Grantham, and one to the Territorial Land Commissioner's office in Helena. Do you have the wire for both?" He did. She composed both messages standing at his counter while Voss went to find whoever served as Black Hollow's closest approximation to law enforcement, which turned out to be a deputy marshal named Rourke, who operated out of an office attached to the back of the general store, and who had, according to Donahue's quick description, a decent reputation for not being in anyone's pocket. The telegraphs cost more than she'd brought, and Donahue waved the difference off with a gesture that said he'd add it to an account he'd apparently decided they had. "I've been watching Harlan's people come through this town for months," he said, not looking up from the wire key, "asking questions, nosing around the land records. I know what they're about." He finished tapping and looked at her. "I'm glad you two are still standing." "So are we," she said. "Chasse." Deputy Marshal Rourke was a lean man in his 50s with a careful face and the habit of listening completely before he spoke, which Brenna recognized immediately as either the sign of a thoughtful man or a cautious one, and by the end of their conversation she determined he was both. He listened to everything. He asked questions that were specific and practical. How many men? What time? What direction they came from? What exactly was said about the Land Commission Authority? He looked at the piece of fabric she'd brought from the east door hinge and turned it over in his hands. "Harlan Mining's a big name to put in a report," he said when she'd finished. "It's the accurate name," she said. He looked at Voss. "You've refused their offers." "4 times, Voss said. "And the claim is legitimate. Filed, registered, confirmed." 7 years ago. Rourke set the fabric down on his desk. "The legal challenge they filed in Helena, that's above my jurisdiction. That goes to the commissioner." He tapped the fabric. "What happened last night, on your property, that's not above my jurisdiction. That's arson and attempted forced entry, and I don't care whose name is behind it." "Will you put that in writing?" Brenna asked. He looked at her steadily. "I'll do better than that. I'll write up and see the site myself." She hadn't expected that. She allowed herself a brief revision of her estimate of Black Hollow upward. "When?" "Give me 2 days to get my affairs in order. I'll come up Thursday." They shook on it, which felt strange and also exactly right. The particular satisfaction of a handshake with someone who means it. Hale arrived 10 days later, which was faster than she dared calculate on. He came by horse from Grantham with a document case that appeared to contain half a forest's worth of paper, in a manner that reminded her of a man who'd been waiting for a reason to move and had finally been given one. He was shorter than she'd imagined from his letters, compact and energetic, with the particular intensity of a lawyer who cared about the cases he took, rather than just the fees. He shook Voss's hand with the warmth of 2 men who'd known each other a long time, and whose knowing had survived distance and silence intact. He shook Brenna's hand and said, "The letters you wrote were the best documentation I've seen on a property dispute in 15 years of practice." "I had good material to work with," she said. "You had good instincts. Material is nothing without instincts." He spread everything on the table and walked them through it, and the picture that emerged was satisfying in the specific way that an argument you've been building in pieces finally assembled into its full shape. The legal challenge Harlan had filed in Helena was thin. Hale had read every word of it and had prepared a response that he described, with quiet professional satisfaction, as comprehensive. They challenged the mineral rights attachment on procedural grounds. The grounds don't exist. Your original survey documentation is textbook correct. I'd expect nothing less from a trained surveyor. The challenge will fail, and I filed a counterclaim that flags the pattern of harassment, the threatening correspondence, and the events of April 12th for the commissioner's attention. And the commissioner? Voss asked. Commissioner Walsh is not a man I'd call Harlan's friend. He's been watching Harlan's activity in the territory for 2 years. This case gives him something to act on. Hale paused. The events of April 12th specifically. Rourke's report on the site visit is extremely useful. An official record of arson and attempted forced removal puts Harlan's people in criminal territory, and Harlan himself in the position of a man who either ordered it or employed people who acted in his name without his knowledge, neither of which is comfortable. What about the Wyoming case? Brenna asked. Martin Dell. Hale looked at her with something that was close to admiration. Dell's statement arrived the week before I left Grantham. He was thorough. He was angry in the specific way of someone who's been waiting for the chance to be useful. His account of Harlan's methods in Wyoming, combined with what happened here and the pattern of approaches documented in your correspondence, gives a picture that goes beyond one dispute. It shows a practice, she said. It shows a practice, Hale agreed. That's what you need to make a man like Harlan expensive. Not one fight, a pattern of behavior that the law can no longer politely ignore. The official letter from the Territorial Commissioner's office came 6 weeks later. Brenna read it twice at the table, methodically, before she let herself register what it said. The challenge to Voss's claim was dismissed in full. The dismissal cited procedural inadequacy of the filing, the strength and completeness of the original claim documentation, and, this was the part she read 3 times, the evidence of a systematic campaign of intimidation and coercion that constituted a violation of territorial property law. A separate investigation had been opened into Harlan Mining's conduct in the territory. She set the letter down. She looked at it. It was just paper. It was just ink. It was just words arranged in official language. And it was the most concrete thing she'd ever held. She heard Voss come in from outside. He came to the table and she slid the letter across without speaking. She watched him read it. She watched his face move through something he didn't have a name for, something older than relief. The particular release of a man who'd been braced against a weight for so long that the removal of the weight was itself a kind of shock. He set the letter down. His hands were not entirely steady. "It's done," she said. "It's done," he agreed. Then he laughed. It was short and unexpected and real. Not the ghost of a smile, but the actual thing, and it transformed his face into something that was, she thought, what he'd looked like before 7 years of solitude and grief and defending a mountain had carved him into the man who'd ridden into Black Hollow. She'd gotten glimpses of it through the winter. This was the full version. She laughed too, and it came out uneven and too loud and didn't care. Victor Harlan did not go quietly, because men like him never did, but he went. The investigation into his territorial conduct produced findings that his lawyers could not fully contain, and 2 of the men involved in the April raid were identified by Rourke and faced charges that were documented and public and attached to Harlan's name in ways that cost him considerably. He sold 3 of his other territorial claims in the months that followed and redirected his attention southward, which meant Black Hollow and the mountain above it ceased to be interesting to him in the fundamental way that stopped mattering to a man who moved on to easier ground. Brenna heard about it from Hale's letters and from Harriet, who had become a reliable channel for what moved through Black Hollow's consciousness. Harriet's letters were short and factual, and occasionally contained a dry observation about local affairs that made Brenna smile at the table over her morning coffee. The last letter about Harlan was a single sentence from Hale. His Helena attorney has withdrawn from the territorial investigation, which tells you everything you need to know about where this ends. She showed it to Voss. He read it and put it in the strongbox with the other documents, and that was the last time either of them spoke Harlan's name in any serious way. The workshop took the summer to rebuild, and it was better than the original. This was partly because Voss knew the site's weaknesses now and corrected them. The new building was set slightly differently, with a stone skirt around the base that would slow any future attempt at arson, and partly because Brenna organized the interior before the walls went up, which meant the storage made actual sense this time. She also expanded the kitchen garden by a third, taking over a section of ground on the south-facing slope that got better light and had been sitting there unused since Voss arrived because he hadn't needed more than one man's worth of vegetables. She needed more than that now, and was beginning to think about more than that. It was a conversation they'd been circling for a while. She brought it up directly on an August evening when the light was doing that long amber thing over the valley and they were sitting on the porch with the last of the coffee. "I've been thinking about the East Ridge," she said. He looked at her. He knew she didn't mean the approach path. "There's a flat section, maybe 2 acres, with good drainage and access to the creek. You could put 3 cabins there without crowding, 4 if you built small." "Who would build them?" "We would, with help." She held the coffee cup in both hands. "Harriet knows a family in Black Hollow, a widow and her 2 children, been there 3 years. Her husband died in a mine accident. They've been struggling since. She mentioned them to me back in winter. I've been thinking about it since." Voss was looking down the valley. "You want to bring people up here?" "I want to offer it. It's different." She looked at him steadily. "You chose this mountain because it had been left alone and you wanted to protect it. That's still true, but protecting it doesn't have to mean keeping it empty." She paused. "There's enough space up here for people who need a place. People who've been told they don't fit somewhere." He turned to look at her, and she saw that he understood what she was saying beneath the practical surface of it, that she was talking about the thing that had brought them both here in the first place, the particular experience of being the one left standing when everyone else had found a place. "A widow and her children," he said. "To start. And then whoever needs it." She set down the coffee. "We have the land. We have the claim, clearly and legally. We have the mountain. We've already proven we can hold it." She looked at him. "The question is what we hold it for." He was quiet for a long while. The valley light shifted and the pines moved in the evening wind, and somewhere down the mountain a creek was doing the persistent, ordinary work of moving water from one place to another. "The East Ridge," he said finally. "The East Ridge. We'd need to run a proper path down to the water." "Yes. And the cabins would need to be built before winter. We'd need to start soon." "I know that." He was quiet another moment. "I can't do it alone in the time we have." "I know that too." She'd been waiting for this. "There's a man in Black Hollow. I met him when we were there in April. Harriet mentioned him. A carpenter. He lost his work when the mine's construction project fell through. He's been looking for something. I thought we might write to him." Voss looked at her with that expression she'd learned, the one that appeared when she'd done something in advance of the conversation that assumed its outcome, which she did fairly regularly and which he'd decided at some point in the winter to find more funny than irritating. "You've already thought of the carpenter," he said. "I thought it through, yes." "Did you write to him?" "Not yet. I was going to tell you first." "That's progress," he said, and the edge of that smile was back, fully present this time, entirely meant. She laughed. It was an honest laugh, the kind that came from being known by someone and not minding. The widow's name was Agnes Colum, and she arrived in early September with her children, a boy of 10 named Peter and a girl of 7 named May, on the back of a mule cart that Voss had sent down with the carpenter to collect them, because the trail in its current state required someone who knew it. Brenna was in the garden when she heard the cart coming up the east approach, the new and improved east approach that Voss and the carpenter, whose name was Jim Pruitt, had spent 3 weeks widening and grading until it was something you could actually navigate with a load. She set down her tools and went to meet them. Agnes Colm was a small, sharp-featured woman in her 40s, with the look of someone who'd been worrying efficiently for a long time and had gotten good at it. She climbed down from the cart and looked around at the mountain and the lodge and the half-built cabin frame on the East Ridge. And then she looked at Brenna. "You're Mrs. Voss," she said. "Brenna," she said. "Welcome to the mountain." Agnes looked at her with the careful assessment of a woman who'd been told something was available and was determining whether to trust the telling. "I wasn't sure what to expect." "Neither was I when I came here," Brenna said. "It turned out better than I anticipated." She looked at the children, who were already climbing on the porch railing. "Peter, May, come down from there before Mr. Voss comes out and sees you." They came down, not because they were intimidated, but because the authority in her voice was matter-of-fact, rather than unkind, the voice of someone who expected to be listened to and usually was. She'd developed that voice over the winter, and it had taken some practice. Voss came out of the workshop. the new workshop, rebuilt and solid, and the children looked at him, and May, the 7-year-old, said without apparent hesitation, "You're very big." "I know," Voss said. "Does your head hit the door frames?" "Some of them." "Which ones?" He thought about it seriously. "The storage room and the back of the workshop." He looked at Peter. "You want to see the forge?" Peter's face answered that before he did. Agnes watched Voss take her children toward the workshop, and when she turned back to Brenna, some of the careful assessment had softened into something more frank. "Harriet said you were... She said it would be safe here," Agnes said. "I needed to hear it from someone I trusted." "It's safe," Brenna said. "It wasn't always, but it is now, and we intend to keep it that way." Agnes nodded, looked at the cabin frame on the east ridge. "Is that mine?" "Yours and your children's. It'll be done by October. Until then, there's room in the lodge." She picked up her garden tools. "Come inside. The coffee's on." 3 more families came that first year. A craftsman and his wife from Porter's Creek who'd heard something through Harriet's network. The way news moved through the territory was its own kind of infrastructure, slow and organic, and surprisingly reliable. A young woman on her own, a seamstress named Ruth, who'd been in Black Hollow with nowhere particular to go and had heard about the mountain from the postmaster's wife. An older man, a former school teacher named Aldous, who'd retired from teaching in the East and wanted, he said plainly, somewhere that wasn't used up yet. He said that at the table his first night, over the supper Brenna had made, a bigger table now, extended with a section Voss had built in the spring, and Brenna looked at Voss across the room when Aldous said it and saw him hear it, saw him register the echo of his own reasoning spoken back to him by a stranger. Somewhere that wasn't used up yet. They built. That was the simplest way to put it. They built cabins and a proper path to the creek and a shared root cellar with enough capacity for a community rather than 2 people. And Pruitt turned out to be good enough at his work that the buildings he put up had a quality to them that would last. He also turned out to be a sociable man who cooked badly and talked too much at breakfast and fixed anything mechanical within a 3-cabin radius, whether he'd been asked to or not, which was occasionally irritating and mostly useful. The garden expanded. Brenna expanded it herself in stages, bringing in Agnes and Ruth when they were interested, which they often were. There was something about building something edible from ground that had been wilderness that appealed to all of them in a way that was hard to fully articulate. The satisfaction of a potato pulled from soil you'd cultivated yourself, of beans from a vine you'd set and staked and watched. She caught herself talking to the plants in Irish one afternoon and didn't bother being embarrassed about it. Old habits were old habits. Aldous asked if he could teach the children, Peter and May, and the 2 children who came with the craftsman's family. He set up in the cleared section of the lodge on weekday mornings, and the sound of children's voices doing arithmetic and reading aloud became part of the mountain's texture, layered in with the wind and the water and the sound of Pruitt's hammer from wherever he was working that day. It was imperfect, all of it. Agnes and Ruth had a serious falling out in December over something that began as a practical disagreement about shared root cellar storage and became, in the way these things do, a conflict about something older and more personal, and it took 3 weeks and a mediation from Brenna that she'd found exhausting and uncomfortable and not entirely successful to get them back to functional. The craftsman's wife, a woman named Eleanor, struggled badly through the first winter, not with the cold or the work, but with the loneliness of missing her sisters back east, a specific grief she'd underestimated, and that showed up in her face at unexpected moments. Brenna made a point of sitting with her in the evenings when she could, not always talking, just being present in the way that presence sometimes is the thing. There were hard months. There were arguments about the shared work distribution that required actual decisions rather than good intentions. There was the spring storm that took out part of the new root cellar roof and required a week of repair work and weather that made everyone short-tempered. There were the ordinary frictions of people living in close quarters with different habits and different histories and different ideas about how things should be done. None of it was what Brenna would have called smooth, but none of it was what she would have called wrong either. It was the texture of something real. Voss finished the painting in late spring of their second year on the mountain together. He'd been working on it since winter, in the evenings, in the time after supper when the lodge was quiet, and the settlement on the East Ridge had gone to its own lights, and the mountain was doing its nighttime work around them. She'd known about it the way she knew about most of his projects, through the peripheral evidence, the particular set of his attention when he came in from the studio space he'd cleared in the rebuilt workshop, the way he deflected when she looked too directly at what he was working on. He brought it in one evening and set it on the table without ceremony. "It's not finished," he said, which was what he said about most of his paintings. "But I wanted you to see it." It was the mountain, the settlement, the lodge, the cabins on the East Ridge, the smoke from the chimneys, the path to the creek that Pruitt had built with the stone edging that had been her idea, the garden in its summer fullness, small figures in it barely indicated but present. It was a community, painted on this mountain where there had been nothing but one man and his solitude and a silver vein in the rock that he'd chosen not to touch because he'd wanted to protect the place from being consumed. She looked at it for a long time. "You can see the valley from this angle," she said finally. "Did you paint it from the high ridge?" "The northern overlook. Took 4 mornings." She looked at the small figures. She could identify them if she tried. The size of one of them was unmistakable. "You put us all in it?" "Yes." "Including Pruitt." "He earned it." She laughed, and it was the honest kind. She looked at the painting and felt something she'd been feeling in pieces for 2 years settle into a complete shape. Not happiness exactly, not in the simple way the word gets used, but something more durable. The sense of a thing built rather than found. The satisfaction that comes not from arriving somewhere, but from the work of making a place worth arriving at. She thought about Black Hollow and the mud and the men who hadn't chosen her and the one who had, and she thought about the specificity of what had been built since, not from a plan, but from a series of decisions, some good and some less good, and all of them real. The letters at the kitchen table, the winter storm, the brace on the door that held, the fabric from the hinge that became evidence, the East Ridge with its cabins and its smoke. She thought about what it meant to belong somewhere, and she thought it was not the thing she'd been taught to think it was. Not a condition you found, not a place that accepted you, but something closer to the action of showing up and refusing to leave. You earned belonging the same way you earned anything else that mattered. By staying when leaving would have been easier. By working when rest would have been more comfortable. By choosing again every morning the thing you'd chosen once before. "It's good work," she said. Meaning the painting, meaning everything. "It's getting there," he said. She turned from the painting and looked at him. At the man who'd ridden into a frontier town for salt and made a decision in the mud that had altered both of their lives in ways neither of them could have anticipated, who'd spent 7 years building something on a mountain alone, and then, almost accidentally, learned to build it with someone. His face was easier than it had been. Not soft, that wasn't the right word, and wouldn't be, but easier. Like something that had been held at attention had found, not release exactly, but a proper use for itself. "I want to build a schoolhouse," she said. "A real one, separate from the lodge. Aldous deserves a proper space, and the children need more room than the lodge gives them." He looked at her. "How big?" "1 main room enough for 12 students. If we grow past that, we'll add." "Pruitt could frame it in a month." "I know. I was thinking spring, before the planting gets serious." "All right," he said. "I'll draw up the plans." "I already have some ideas about the light," she said. "The windows should face east." He looked at her with that expression. The one she'd catalogued over 2 years of marriage. The one that appeared when she'd already started a thing she was asking him about. The one that was somewhere between exasperation and a deep involuntary fondness that he'd stopped trying to keep off his face sometime around November of their first year. "Of course you do," he said. She smiled. "Tomorrow?" "Tomorrow," he agreed. Outside, the mountain was going about its evening. The settlement on the East Ridge had its lights up, warm squares of yellow in the dusk. Agnes's children were probably driving her to distraction at the supper table because they drove everyone to some level of distraction, and that was part of what children were for. Pruitt was probably talking too much to whoever was closest to him. Aldous was probably reading something that would occupy his thinking for days, and that he'd want to discuss at breakfast whether anyone was ready for it or not. The silver was still in the ground. It had been there before any of them arrived and would be there long after. Voss had never touched it, and they'd talked about it exactly once in a serious way on a winter evening of the first year. "If you needed it," she'd said, If we needed it. If we genuinely needed it, he'd said, with the emphasis that meant genuinely, not conveniently. Yes, but not before that. And if Harlan had won, he'd been quiet. Then someone else would have taken it out of the ground and called it progress. He'd looked at the fire. That's the thing about land. Someone always wants what's in it. The question is whether you get to decide what it becomes. They'd decided. That was the plain fact of it. They'd decided through the letters, and the winter and the night the workshop burned, and the long, slow work of building something after. They decided and kept deciding, which was the only way deciding ever actually worked. The painting on the table caught the last of the evening light from the west window. The mountain in it was the same mountain outside the glass, and the people in it were the same people whose voices drifted across from the east ridge in the warm spring air, and the life it depicted was the life actually being lived. That was not a small thing. That was, in fact, the thing. The thing that most people spent their whole lives reaching for in one form or another, called by different names in different languages. The sense that where you were and what you were doing and who you were doing it with had weight, had meaning, had been chosen rather than simply fallen into. Neither of them had been chosen easily. Brenna had stood in the mud of Black Hollow while 9 women before her found a hand reaching for them. Voss had spent 7 years being a story people told at a distance, a rumor, a warning, a man shaped by everyone else's fear of him into something smaller than he was. They had chosen each other out of circumstances that were, on the surface, nothing like the basis of a life. A stranger on a horse, a woman with 2 bags and nowhere to go, a town that laughed, and from those specific and imperfect materials, this, not a perfect life. Not a life without grief or friction or hard months or arguments over root cellar storage. Not a life that had turned out the way either of them had planned, because neither of them had been in a position to plan something this good. A real one. That was enough. That was, in the end, everything. On the highest part of the North Ridge, where Voss had stood 4 mornings to paint the overlook, you could see the whole of it in one frame. The lodge, the settlement, the garden, the new path to the creek, the smoke of 7 chimneys against the Montana sky. And if you stood there long enough, you might see 2 people come out of the lodge in the evening light and stand on the porch together, not saying much, looking at the valley below. A woman with her hair loose from the braid by the end of the day, a man with hands too large for ordinary things, and a scar along his jaw that had long since stopped being the most interesting thing about him. Just 2 people who had stood their ground when the world suggested they had no ground to stand on, who had built something from nothing worth staying for, and who had stayed.